Hello, everyone. Welcome to week two's lecture. I am really, I believe that situating this presentation and this topic at this point in the class is really important. So, person of the therapist and that model ultimately asks you to reflect on your social location, your history, your beliefs, things that we talked about last week, which is so important. You are the tool in the room. And then we're also going to interweave in here the concepts of intersectionality and then power positions. So intersectionality is essentially understanding that you have multiple pieces of your identity. So for me, I identify as a cisgender woman. I am white. I am married. I am a mother. I identify as bisexual. I was raised upper middle class. I am educated. I am able-bodied. I don't identify with any religion. I identify, I think, more so as spiritual. I have a history of loss. So I could go on. I'm sure that there are maybe even big ones that I haven't identified. But each piece of my identity in isolation is what I would consider reductive. So if you look at me and just make assumptions about what you see, which is what we do as a therapist, if I walked into your room, if I were your client and I walked into your room, you would make some assessments of me based on nothing more than what I look like, and that is evolutionarily purposeful. I just think about how humans and just how living beings assess safety and risk. So like we would look at one another to see, like, are you a part of my like tribe or my group, my community? Are you a threat? We are mammals that do that. And also we live in a society that socializes us to think in certain stigmatized, discriminatory ways. So I just want to normalize that, like, making these flash judgments about people is normal, and you need to become aware of when and how you're doing that. Um, so also with the title here, spending a good amount of time on the title slide here today, um, power positions. We are in an inherent position of power as a therapist. We have training, we have expertise, we have someone coming to us seeking help, seeking our expertise. So, what you bring into the room in terms of your beliefs, your biases, anything that you may be unaware of will affect the therapeutic relationship. It will affect the therapeutic process. So, really, what personal therapist is about is becoming aware of those things. The hope is you don't feel shame about it. You don't feel like, oh no, maybe I shouldn't do this therapy thing. I'm a crap person. It's not about that. If you do get to that place, please don't stay there. It's not useful. It's not useful to have a pity party for yourself. It's about becoming aware of that, making a commitment to change, making a commitment to social justice, to advocacy, to equity, inclusion, diversity, justice. So that's my hope for you and what you do with that. So I like how hopefully we're setting off some good stuff in terms of reflection with these readings. Okay, so our chapter 3 in our textbook talked about third order ethics and contextual self in relationships. So, thinking about this, it is rooted in contextual family therapy. So, you'll be reading about, or you read about things like justice, ledgers, things like that. Um, So, this chapter challenges us to look beyond traditional ethics codes and think about sociocultural and systemic contexts that shape our clients' lives and our therapeutic decisions. So, what we're going to do is look at how culture, power, and privilege influence what we define as ethical practice. So, what is third order ethics? So, to set that up, first order ethics has involved just following rules and codes at the surface level. Second order ethics has emphasized relational processes and awareness of those interactions. And then third order ethics takes the concept of second order ethics further by adding culture, societal, and political contexts that inform our decision making. So ultimately, a question to ask yourself is who benefits from the way that we practice and who is marginalized? So traditional ethical practice often focuses on not breaking professional codes. So non-malfeasance, beneficence, like justice, some of the big, I think, big five. But everyday clinical work reflects ethical positions. So even small choices like whose voice we privilege in the room, what model we use, whether we notice power dynamics, all of these things reflect ethics. So AAMFT's Code of Ethics, for example, begins with non-discrimination. Yet in practice, we as therapists often unintentionally reproduce bias. And in this, essentially, how we do this is by using Eurocentric models, which are the foundation of our field, or treating high status clients, meaning like usually uh, monetarily, like SES, um, with more deference. So, like giving them a little bit more like benefit of the doubt or seeing them more strengths based. And all of these can perpetuate oppression. So, third order ethics asks us to consider broader implications, like I said, than first order and second order. So, some questions that you might ask is when honoring cultural traditions, are we supporting oppression? When clients make autonomous choices, do we account for any structural limitations like poverty, racism, or sexism? And these codes of ethics reflect dominant cultural values. So if they're applied universally without any context, they may unintentionally colonize other cultural groups. So just thinking about ontological, which is like how we know what we know, epistemological, how we've learned what we know, and addressing any injustices in regard to those. Okay, so relational ethics reminds us that all therapy is embedded in relationships and meaning making. So, third order ethics extends this by requiring a meta perspective. How do social power and dominant cultural narratives shape what is considered to be true, valid, or ethical? So, pulling in some narrative prior to covering narrative here. Without this lens, we as therapists risk reinforcing inequity. How we could do this is potentially prioritizing white, male, cishet, upper middle class or upper class perspectives as the most credible. So just thinking about how we have have come to know our worldview, and it's really encouraging, from a person of the therapist focused lens of constant reflection, continuous reflection, and awareness of your social location. And I just want to be very clear of what I mean when I say social location. That is all of those identities within our overall identity, how I situated myself saying I'm white, I'm a woman, I'm cisgender, I'm bisexual, all of these types of things all of those together inform my social location. Ultimately, that just means like how I perceive the world, how I'm received by the world, the perceived value I have in society. That's what social location is in a nutshell. Okay, so in regard to power and neutrality, um, first and foremost, I want to really highlight this red box here. Neutrality is a myth. So, multi-directional partiality was coined within contextual family therapy. So, neutrality is really rooted in, I would say, like foundational psychological approaches um, that looked at us as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Like we bring nothing in terms of beliefs, preferences, anything into the therapeutic space. So it was this to me like very akin to color blindness. Like I don't see color, therefore I can't be racist. So it's like it's essentially kind of saying like I have no beliefs, I have no values, I have nothing rooting me in terms of how I function in this world, which is total baloney. So if you ever hear someone talking about neutrality, that they are neutral, that they're objective, things like that, like don't don't do this that. Don't do that. You are a subjective, partial human. You're partial. It means you have beliefs, you have preferences, you have opinions. So multi-directional partiality or multi-directed, it's the same thing, means that you are giving in many ways like equal validation to each perspective. And remember, validation doesn't have to mean agreement. In order to validate a person's perspective, you do not have to agree with it. So those things are not mutually exclusive. You can very much validate somebody's perspective and like deeply disagree with it. That is possible. I do it all the time. um, with clients who have very different beliefs than I do. Um, so our own identities, values, and assumptions always enter the room. That's why neutrality is a myth. Third order ethics requires constant reflexivity. So that's ultimately asking, how am I affected by the process of therapy and how do I affect the process of therapy? So it's this bi-directional relationship. So you're asking yourself things like, whose interests am I centering? Where do my assumptions come from? Am I unintentionally reproducing injustice? And so it's really important for us to critically examine our own social location, privilege, biases. And this is in order to avoid reinforcing systemic oppression in more subtle ways. So, neutrality has long been seen as a professional standard. As I said, neutrality often maintains a status quo and ignores power differences. Again, like if I come in to a room of people of various colors and say, I don't see color, all I'm doing is reinforcing a status quo. And I am ignoring the fact that race is absolutely a factor in power differences in our world. So socioculturally attuned practices use what has been called multi-directed partiality, which is validating all voices while actively engaging in working for equity. So equity is different than equality. Equality is everyone gets exactly the same thing. Equity is people get what they need. So it's more catered to that. Um, so Betty Carter once said, therapists cannot escape their social positions. We can only decide to engage them either consciously or unconsciously. So power is inherent in therapy. Like I said, this is through expertise, social location, systemic context, all of those things. Some therapists, particularly those, sorry if you hear that plane going by, some therapists, particularly those with marginalized identities, may need to actively claim their authority to be taken seriously. Using power responsibly means challenging oppressive dynamics while still collaborating with clients to build trust and accountability. So, in terms of how all of this applies to supervision, supervisors model this reflexivity that I was talking about. They're modeling they, how their positionality, how they show up in supervision affects the supervision process and how they're affected by the supervision process. So ultimately, what that means is so there's a term in supervision called isomorphism, which essentially means that supervisors are modeling for you what they would like you to do in therapy. So if you think of kind of a hierarchy of power, it's supervisor, therapist, client. So in the supervisor therapist role, the therapist has less power, but in the therapist client role, the therapist has more power. So the hope is that you have a good supervisor who guides you, that you like want to take some of their characteristics, some of their approaches with you into therapy. So also within supervision, there should be equity that's integrated throughout. Alliant does this in some, I would say, like policy-based ways, like accommodations for any sort of disability or any needs, religious accommodations, things like that, for students, so that it's not just, we only recognize like mainstream holidays or something like that. But also, this is again catering to the needs of the students and then moving beyond special topics. So, meaning like, diversity isn't just a class that you take, or working with neurodivergent clients isn't just a lecture that you take, that these are things that are embedded throughout your training. Okay, so the next article or next reading we had was Reframing Family Systems Theory, the Central Roles of Race and Racism. So why should we need to reframe family systems theory? That's FST. So as we know, traditional family systems therapy has been decontextualized, meaning that it just like it doesn't take these larger systems that affect the individual into consideration. So family therapy theories have been treated as if they apply universally. And sometimes, like race and racism are the quote unquote elephant in the room. And this is very, um, I think this is really important to keep in mind, knowing also that the majority of therapists, like mental health practitioners, are white. And as a white person, um, we're not, in my experience, we're not socialized well to how to engage in conversations with people, with fellow white people, with people who don't look like us. So it's this like topic that it's like, if I bring it up, is it appropriate? I'm just going to wait until my client brings it up, because I don't want them to think like that's how I see them, or that's all I'm paying attention to. And the fact of the matter is, y'all, so remember, going back to power, we have the power in the room. I encourage all of you to become very comfortable talking about social location with your clients. So you can situate yourself. Ask them, what's it like sharing your story with me? So the reason I say this is what I always teach within my theories classes, as well as with my practicum students and any supervisees, is given that we are in the position of power, it is our duty to broach topics, meaning to bring them up, to initiate conversation about them. It is very important to socially contextualize and culturally contextualize, sociopolitically contextualize your clients and bring that into the room as just a part of the conversation. So if you're like, well, I don't want to come off a certain way, you can't control that. And I promise you, the more that you practice staying away from it, the more and more uncomfortable you're going to be with it. So just talk about it. Tell me how you were raised affects you. What is it like for you being XYZ in society? How is that relevant to what brings you to therapy? Because it is. Like I know sometimes we hear in like political rhetoric that from certain people, people make everything's about race. We make everything political, and you'll learn about this in this class. It's because it is. Everything is political. Everything is informed by things like race, because race is one of the biggest social organizers of our society, along with socioeconomic status. Um, so, for what it's worth, and then, James in particular talks about how Black families cannot be treated as a monolith. That just means like not all Black families are the same. Like that's essentially, like I know that probably sounds like very obvious, but I think also many times what we do as therapists and as humans is we categorize people. So again, if we don't make explicit some of the questions we have, talking about culture, talking about things like race, socioeconomic status, we will see that information about somebody and make assumptions without even recognizing it. Um, so just to keep that in mind, of as long as you can bring those conversations into the room, better understand how these apply to this particular individual, this particular family, this particular system. If you don't have that information, I promise you, your mind is going to fill in those blanks. So ultimately, another thing here is that family systems theory or therapy must reflect societal context and systemic oppression. We must talk about how these structures and cultures, or structures, institutions shape our everyday family life. So one thing that was proposed is racial and ethnic socialization, of bringing that into the room. So for short, it's RES. This is one of the most important family processes in African American families in particular. Parents intentionally prepare children to develop resilience, racial pride, and strategies for coping with systemic racism. So there's four tenets here. Cultural socialization, so having that sense of racial pride, being prepared for bias, being prepared for the world is going to see you in a specific way. They're going to categorize you in a specific way. They're going to have assumptions about you. And that says more about that person than that does of you. Stay grounded in who you are. And also, there's a way to act, to behave, to keep you safe, to survive. There is also there can be a promotion of mistrust within certain institutions, for example, like medical systems, and another tenet of egalitarianism. So RES has the goal is to protect children's health and survival. As we know, a conversation that many Black parents have with their children is walking through how to interact with the police. I do not know a single one of my white family friends who have had that conversation. And also some rules it's to teach children the societal rules of racism, how to navigate that without losing self, how to navigate that and protect against internalizing those stigmas or biases, adjusting socialization as racism shifts forms. So this essentially all shows us, and then inputs, outputs, talking about cybernetics, bringing that cybernetic piece into here, about how feedback loops work within a racialized environment. So this shows us how FST concepts map directly onto the racial socialization process. Families act as a dynamic system that are embedded in these larger essentially racist structures. So over time, historical time explains why African American families shifted from majority two-parent households in the 19th century to a majority single-parent household today. This shift is linked directly to policies rooted in systemic racism. Policies that have shaped the lives of Black families, slavery and forced separations, redlining and the racial wealth gap, mass incarceration. So the reason that I think it's very important to understand historical context of families, of groups of people, is many times the rhetoric is around personal responsibility. There and that this is this person's choice to be like this. And yes, it's both and, because we are autonomous beings and we are beings that live in systems that very, very much influence how we live. So I encourage you um, to think, for example, we're talking specifically here about Black families, that like one thing that I always say to students is thinking about how we frame risk factors. So, for example, like being Black is not a risk factor. Racism is a risk factor. Like racism is the problem. Being Black is not the problem. So, just thinking about these historical policies and how they affect family structures today, there's a legacy of this happening with particular racial and ethnic groups with particular socioeconomic statuses. So please think about the larger systems and the historical influence. So families were often denied agency in structuring themselves. And again, like I said, choice challenges the assumption that families freely self-organize. So Black families, for example, historically had little say in their structure due to slavery, discriminatory policies, systemic behavior, or systemic barriers. So slavery, families disrupted at the owner's will, at the families didn't have a choice as to how to structure the individuals who were enslaved. Their lives were dictated by other people who owned them. Structural racism, there were limited choices in housing, schooling, mobility. We know about segregation and extremely racist policies. And then they essentially created adaptive kinship networks. So having grandparents, fictive kin, trying to extend that community and have more collectivistic type of family structures. So implications with the application of RES. This must inform interventions. If we take just traditional family systems therapy or theory interventions and apply them universally to everyone, it will not work. Ultimately, this reframed theory will help therapists, policymakers, you can see here, and researchers avoid deficit-based views and instead recognize resilience in the midst of systemic challenges, systemic barriers, just being disproportionately disadvantaged. So what we tend to do is look at, because of the history of our field and the pervasiveness of white supremacy, we tend to see like white families, or like a traditional view of families, and others. And when we see other, we tend to see difference as a negative. So just keep that in mind. This is me offering it to you for you to really sit with yourself and say, do I do that? If I do, how do I feel about that? How might I change that? Because that's very important to do so. Also, with research, including different races, including a history of racism, including the effects of that, understanding history, and how that informs our research. So, in conclusion, reframing family systems theory in this way makes it not only more inclusive, but also more accurate. It urges us to integrate theory with the lived experiences of marginalized families. So here, family systems theory is enriched by centering race and racism, adding historical time, adding the concept of choice. So this helps us to better support, specifically because it was created for African American families, for Black families. Well, I'll say African American. Um, yeah, I'll say Black. Just think like there's a difference. So because I'm just thinking about like even if there are Black individuals within the United States that don't have a family history of being enslaved, they're still lumped in many ways as a monolith. So anyway, just thinking about how it supports African American families in its creation, and also just families of various races, various ethnicities, again, various races and ethnicities. So then I think our final reading for the class is talking about queer theory, intersectionality, and LGBT parent families. This was Few and Demo's 2016 article that integrates queer theory and intersectionality into the study of LGBT parent families. Ultimately, this article critiques traditional family scholarship for reinforcing heteronormativity and argues for more nuanced approaches. So what we're going to do in these slides is unpack their arguments, key findings and implications for family therapy, also how it can apply to policy and research. So keeping in mind that this is a postmodern course, and the purpose of this is about challenging dominant narratives about like what is a appropriate family, a healthy family, a functioning family, and broadening views of how we see them. Okay, so background here. Um, so ultimately, the authors explain how heteronormativity and cisnormativity dominate family scholarship. Historically, families have been studied through a white middle class heterosexual lens that frames LGBTQ plus parents as different or deviant. And, maybe they don't use explicit language like that. Many times it's more subtle and implicit. And also, the authors of this article argue that scholarship is not neutral. It actively can reinforce inequity and inequality. So they position the queer theory and intersectionality as critical lenses for shifting how families are understood, emphasizing diversity and lived realities. So here you can see about 37% of LGBTQ plus adults have children, and 2 million children are raised in LGBTQ families or by LGBTQ plus parents. And research shows no difference in children's well-being when it's compared to heterosexual families. So family theories were developed, as I said, from a heteronormative assumption, and LGBTQ plus parent families often feel ignored or tokenized, positioned as disadvantaged. Again, thinking about like heteronormativity, I'll even say like cis heteronormativity as like the norm, as healthy, and anything that's different, like there must be some sort of disadvantage to it. And many times they feel misrepresented or oversimplified. Again, being treated as a monolith, broad brushstrokes about like what it means to be a part of the LGBTQ community. It's a very, very dynamic and diverse community. So queer theory challenges all of these taken for granted assumptions about gender and sexuality. It resists fixed categories, questioning what counts as quote normal or legitimate in a family. So for example, queer theory would question why marriage and biological reproduction are privileged over other family forms. So again, in the article, queer theory helps highlight how family forms that don't fit dominant scripts still hold meaning, legitimacy, and value. This is critical for therapists and researchers to understand to avoid reinforcing any sort of marginalization. So 5 phases of circular change are also covered in this article. So exclusion is that LGBTQ parents are absent and heteronormative families are represented as universal. Um, compensatory addition is that LGBTQ parents are included, but only as add-ons to existing heteronormative theories. Disadvantaged lens, LGBTQ parent families are framed primarily through a marginalized, or they're framed through marginalization. So they're in the margins, there's a disadvantage, using feminist and minority stress theory to highlight disadvantage. So again, we like use theories to substantiate this disadvantaged lens. Queer and intersectionality integration. So theories critically unpack heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and intersecting identities such as race, gender, class, sexuality, geography that shift to complexity, resilience, and diverse family processes. And then going into a paradigm shift, family theory itself is transformed by queer and intersectional frameworks, broadening the study of all families. So intersectionality is a key lens that's discussed in this article. It examines how overlapping systems of oppression like racism, sexism, heterosexism, heteronormativity, classism, and ableism interact to shape family life. So for LGBTQ plus parent families, intersectionality reveals how experiences vary widely depending on race, socioeconomic status, gender identity, and legal context. So, for example, a white gay male couple with financial resources may experience parenthood very differently than a Black lesbian couple with limited resources. So, you can see how various aspects of their identities differ. And intersectionality ensures we don't generalize LGBTQ plus experience, but instead see them in context. So, it's like the theme of the day. Um, so, queer theory challenges binaries. So, binaries essentially is just like one or the other. So many times, we think about gender, yeah, and sex. We think about gender and sex on like as a binary of one or the other, male, female. And what we know is that gender is socially constructed. That we can identify in many different ways. And we also know that sex isn't biologically binary either. So for those, I mean, people who claim there's only two sexes, like they miss something in their biology class. Straight, gay in terms of gender, sexual orientation, and then like real or pseudo families. Real families are connected by blood, by biology, and any families that aren't. They're considered pseudo families. So queer theory challenges this and examines how heteronormativity affects therapy, how it affects people. And queer theory also views family roles as fluid and again, socially constructed. So how we so for example, how I function as a mom is so socially constructed. It doesn't even necessarily go with my strengths. So for those of you who, are parents or all of us are children of people, what how have we socially constructed our roles in terms of birth order? I'm also an oldest sibling. So I was socialized very differently than my sister. So just think about how like all of these labels we place on people are socially constructed. They're not even necessarily inherent to the person. And when people express themselves in a socially non-traditional way, um, there's consequences to that. And anyway, I'm probably going to get off on a tangent here, but let's talk a little bit about um, intersectionality. So intersecting identities such as race, class, and gender, sexuality, geography, like I said, that's all of these aspects of our identity intersect to make unique people. Every single person on the planet is unique due to these intersecting identities. And intersectionality helps reveal how power and privilege shape families. Um, so there is the goal of having a transformative pedagogy. So this is, and essentially pedagogy is like how we teach, how we prepare students for being therapists. So the goal is to acknowledge heteronormativity and cisnormativity in our teaching, having that be explicit and commit to self-reflexivity and challenging biases. That's the purpose of person of the therapist, self of the therapist work. We want to foster a critical and experiential learning environment. And by critical, it means just like critically looking at exploring. So challenging, how do we know what we know? How have we come to believe what we believe? Is that the truth? Which I'll like, you know, let you in on a little secret. That there's no such thing as a truth or the truth. And then prepare for student resistance, meaning like that if you are feeling defensive, if you're feeling like this is too much, no, I like I'm uncomfortable with challenging this. This is rooted so deeply in what I'm rooted so deeply in this. This is what I've always known. I just encourage you to attune to that and acknowledge the discomfort and that you should feel uncomfortable in your training. You should be learning about yourself. My hope is that you leave this program different from how you came in, aside from learning new skills and things like that. Um, so some implication here is to move from tokenism. So like, my gay friend, um, uh, and like they're awesome and this is what gives me legitimacy by proxy and stuff like that, into critical inclusion. So redefining family therapy and theory through plurality, just meaning like multiple uh different constellations, makeups are all valid. Complexity, so intersectionality is inherently discussing the complexity of the human existence, and everything's rooted in justice. Everything's rooted in a goal of equity. And encouraging students to engage with diversity as a central component when working with clients, not as this like peripheral, like add-on thing. Diversity is um, a key component, a core tenant or a core concept of who we are, a core piece of our identities.